New Netherlands West India Company Director General Pieter Stuyvesant was going through some things. After arriving in New Amsterdam, Stuyvesant went to work to straighten out the failing colony and tried to undo the damage the previous company directors had done. But a group of residents of New Netherland were fed up with the company's incompetent and dictatorial rulers and demanded a say in the colony's government. The Council of 9 men, who declared independence from Stuyvesant's government, sent delegates to the Dutch Republic to discuss the mismanagement of the colony with the Republic's government, the States General. Stuyvesant, in the middle of border negotiations with the New England governors, sent his representative, Secretary Cornelis van Tienhoven, to the Republic to defend him and his government. I am Yvette. This is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 5 of the story of New Amsterdam. How it started, how it ended, and everything in between. To support the channel, like, comment, subscribe, and share. You can find links to my sources, the music, and other ways to support the channel in the description below. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. In October 1649, the Americans Adriaan van der Donck, Jacob van Couwenhoven and Jan Evertsen Bout arrived in the Republic, where the people were partying like it was 1648, still celebrating the end of the 80 Years' War. Adriaan van der Donck knew complaining to the West India Company Amsterdam Chamber about its mismanagement of the New Netherland colony would be a waste of time. Right or wrong, they backed Director General Pieter Stuyvesant all the way. Instead, the New Netherland delegates appealed directly to the States General, the Republic's federal government in The Hague. I say the Republic's federal government, but that's not quite it. At this point in time, the Republic's government structure was unclear. The States General had kicked out the king and declared itself Lord of the Netherlands, but they weren't nearly as powerful. The Netherlands were a collection of independent states. Each state sent a delegation to the States General, where each state had one vote. The States General ruled on big-ticket items such as war, laws, welfare, and budgets. However, most decisions were left up to the individual states. Since the delegates rotated out often, the permanent raadspensionaris, or grand pensionary, functioned like a modern-day prime minister to guide everyone through the lawmaking process. However, a grand pensionary didn't have a cabinet of ministers and, well, answered to no one. Since all state general decisions required a unanimous vote, there were intense debates and only few resolutions passed. The States General did have a lot of power in overseas colonial affairs, despite the East and West India Companies behaving like independent branches of government, with all kinds of rights and privileges. On October 13, 1649, a few days after the colonists' arrival, the States General, realizing New Netherland was in trouble, made room in their busy schedule and invited over the American delegates, who were joined by Cornelis Melijn, to talk to them. The States General received the American delegation in the Grote Zaal, the Great Hall at the Binnenhof in The Hague, to hear and judge their case. Lawyer Adriaan van der Donck took the lead as he explained the issues and presented his 85-page Remonstrance of New Netherland and the occurrences there, addressed to the High and Mighty Lord States General of the United Netherlands by the people of New Netherland. Van der Donck first described the paradise-like colony, but warned there were snakes in the grass. For one, there were the New Englanders who were fully aware that our country is better than theirs. The States General had to promote the place to the Dutch so they could occupy all the corners before anyone else got their grubby hands on it. It will lose even the name of New Netherland, and no Dutchman will have anything to say there. There were also too many Scots and Chinese, who were petty traders who swarm here with great industry, reap immense profit, and exhaust the country without adding anything to its population or security. But once they skim a little fat from the pot, they take again to their heels. The American delegation also made several requests. They wanted protection from Indian attacks, open trade, and an elected council to limit the West India Company's power. They slammed the Director General for being a tyrant, profiting from a trade monopoly, and punishing anyone who spoke up. They said, His manner in court has been, from his first arrival up to this time, to browbeat, dispute with, and harass one of the two parties. If anyone offer objection, his honor bursts forth incontinently into a rage, and makes such a to-do that it is dreadful. The director's counselors were useless. Vice Director Lubbert van Dinklage was always overruled. Johannes Lamontagne was afraid to speak freely. Brian Newton didn't understand Dutch and just said yes to everything. And Schout-Fiscaal Hendrik Thomassen van Dijk wasn't even allowed to give an opinion. Van der Donck said the company had to go. In our opinion, this country will never flourish under the honorable company's government. It would therefore be better and more advantageous for the country and themselves were they rid of it, and the remnant of their property transported hence. New Netherland should be given a political status within the Dutch system. Van der Donck handed over a metric ton of annotated documents and referral letters to drive his point home. He then presented a committee with all the valuable loot from New Netherland: beaver pelts, tobacco, pumpkins, squash, beets, apples, nuts, corn, and grain. Van der Donck's closing words were that their complaints were made for the love of New Netherland. Well, the Americans had made a bold request, a colony that ruled itself. It wasn't so far-fetched an idea, at least not anymore. The Netherlands in their post-war jubilation were drunk on political activism and legal reform. Big thinkers like René Descartes, Hugo de Groot and Baruch Spinoza introduced wild new ideas. How about a democratically elected government, joint ownership of property, a public school system? Was the Bible literal truth? Amid these new era vibes, the government agreed to consider the radical petition. They appointed a committee to study the matter and advise them. The Americans thought the committee would side with them quickly. Well, not so fast. The States General also heard the colony's secretary Cornelis van Tienhoven, who spoke on behalf of Director General Pieter Stuyvesant. He offered no defense to the accusations. Instead, he discredited the ignorant colonists' motivations as foolish. Some were frauds, some were incompetent self-promoters, some were profiteers, some were in debt to the company, and some simply had nothing to lose. Things were really not that bad, lords. Meanwhile, the West India Company directors, mighty upset with these New Netherland rebels, wrote Stuyvesant. Seditious persons, like Cornelis Melijn, Adriaan van der Donck and some others, seemed to leave nothing untried to upset every kind of government. When they later realized the director initially trusted Two-Face van der Donck, they wrote, "We suppose that you have trusted too much in some of these ringleaders or become too familiar with them. Now that their ingratitude and treachery have come to light, you must still act with the cunning of a fox." Well, he tried. He'd even arrested some of them, planning to execute them, and if it weren't for those council members, he would have gotten away with it too. The company planned to drag out the proceedings and to wear out the strappy young lads by endless, infuriating postponements. Each delay cost Van der Donck and his buddies a fortune and precious time. Then the company got a little unintentional help in their delay tactic. After his father's death in 1647, Prince Willem II of Orange, Count of Nassau, etc., inherited his father's 6 stadholderates, while his cousin, Willem Frederik van Nassau-Dietz, remained stadholder of Friesland. Prince Willem was commander-in-chief of each of the state's armies and navies, but he only had to obey the Council of State and the orders of the States General. Only days after the Manhattan delegates had presented their petition, the states of Holland, fed up footing 58% of the total military bill, voted to ditch the army. Cities like Amsterdam, Dordrecht, Delft, Haarlem, Hoorn and Medemblik felt, now that the war was over, keeping a large military force was no longer necessary. The Prince of Orange was like, and I took that personally. Willem sent out orders to the army officers to keep on their troops, and they obeyed him. Who was in charge? The states who funded the armies? Or the States General who ordered the armies around via its Captain General? Well, the Council of State, but that's not important now. The other 6 states felt that a single state didn't have the right to reduce its army. Well, Holland had the right to stop paying into the war chest, leading to a reduction of troops, forts, and supplies. The navy was funded differently and was safe, for now. Still, the 5 independent admiralties had started selling off many ships just after the 80 Years' War ended. But the 6 other states were like, hold up, we're on the front lines here. Everyone frantically met with everyone to sort out the mess, and it was a mess. The prince agreed that while a small part of the army could be disbanded, they couldn't afford to get complacent now. The war had only just ended. France was fighting its way through the Spanish Netherlands toward the Republic. The Spanish were preparing to declare war again, ready to throw their support behind the exiled Duke of Lorraine who had invaded northern Brabant. The Spanish were also plotting to retake Dunkirk from the French. Dunkirk had been a notorious pirate's nest in Spanish hands. If it fell, because France didn't care about keeping the place, the Dutch trading companies stood to lose millions. Then there was Ferdinand von Bayern, the Bishop of Luik and Münster and Archbishop-Elector of Köln, who demanded the removal of states troops in Rheinberg, just across the Republic's eastern border in the neutral zone. When the bishop's opponents asked the Republic for help, Prince Willem eagerly planned a military campaign, but the town surrendered before he arrived. And does anyone even know what England was gonna do? Maybe they're gonna declare war. Secretly, the prince was actually hoping to join France and reboot the war with Spain, but he wouldn't say that quiet part out loud. Either way, in such uncertain times, the Dutch needed well-trained troops to be prepared for such emergencies. The army mostly consisted of hired mercenaries. Half of the 30 infantry regiments in the army were Dutch. The other half were 5 French, 4 English, 3 Scottish, and 3 German. The Dutch could be rallied quickly in case of an incursion, but those foreign troops, not. Holland put their foot down. They didn't care about any foreign shenanigans. Holland had been picking up the bill for the other states for decades. They were beyond done. If they wanted a proper army, everyone had to pay their own share. This type of disagreement was never addressed in the Union of Utrecht, the document that established the rights and privileges between rebel states. It only said that if the states couldn't agree on decisions that had to be taken unanimously, such as military actions and taxes, the outcome would be determined by the stadholders for the time being. In 1650, they were Prince Willem and Count Willem Frederik. Holland didn't think these 2 House of Nassau members were exactly impartial, but if an agreement couldn't be reached, there was a stalemate. And a stalemate could only be broken by force. As you can imagine, the States General had their hands full with this sort of constitutional crisis, and therefore all other matters, like those of New Netherland, were shelved. Meanwhile, both France and Spain, still duking it out in the Spanish Netherlands, tried to get Prince Willem and his mother Amalia zu Solms in their respective corners. Spain had given Mom properties for her help in convincing her husband, the late Prince Frederik Hendrik, to commit to peace. She feared she'd lose them if she sided with France. The Spanish envoy, Antoine Brun, tried to bribe Willem with gifts. He declined. It's peace now. You can accept the gifts. No, thank you. Brun then offered the prince the position of commander-in-chief of the Spanish forces in their wars against the Ottomans and the Portuguese. You'd think a warhawk like Willem would jump at this prestigious opportunity, but he gave them a curt response. Ik zal nooit vergeten dat een koning van Spanje mijn grootvader heeft laten vermoorden. I will never forget that a king of Spain had my grandfather murdered. France also offered Willem the world. They certainly didn't want a republic in the neighborhood, and they wanted to arrange it so the prince could get that crown he craved. Meanwhile, amid all this chaos, Van der Donck got busy elsewhere. Adriaan van der Donck went on a promo tour for the New Netherland colony. He visited his family in Breda and convinced his parents and one of his brothers and his family to join him in New Netherland. He also went looking for a publisher for his Vertoog, which told the history of the settlement of the Dutch colony in North America with many interesting facts concerning their progress and needs. But since it was also a direct assault on the West India Company, no one dared to publish it. In the end, he found the fearless Michiel Staal, a book and pamphlet printer willing to publish it, along with pretty maps. This book was the one thing the company couldn't have right now. Their venture was already considered a failure, with the 206 guilders share price having dropped to 14. But the book was a hit, and inspired many to pack up and leave for New Netherland. Van der Donck chartered a ship to bring 140 people across, with hundreds more waitlisted. The lawyer quickly told the States General, "See, we are popular." Van der Donck then convinced the Amsterdam chamber of the WIC to pay for a ship with another 200 settlers. The chamber wrote to Stuyvesant. The name of New Netherland was scarcely ever mentioned before, and now it would seem as if heaven and earth are stirred up by it, and everyone tries to be the first in selecting the best pieces of land there. Meanwhile, the States General ordered all the chambers of the West India Company to send representatives to The Hague within 2 weeks to discuss the whole New Netherlands situation with the Manhattan delegates. The States General's Special Committee, appointed to consider the Americans' requests, was leaning toward the New Netherland cause. However, Cornelis van Tienhoven kept protesting that they would undermine the political power of the company, Director General Stuyvesant and his council. The colony was just fine. Van der Donck's gloom and doom report was vastly exaggerated. Besides, New Netherland was much better off than New England. Phew-wee, those colonies were a real disaster. In April 1650, the committee issued a provisional order concerning the government, preservation and peopling of New Netherland, and declared that after having inquired into the system of government hitherto maintained in New Netherland, the States General cannot and ought not any longer approve of the perverse administration of the privileges and benefits granted by charter to the stockholders of the West India Company, while neglecting or opposing the good plans and offers submitted for the security of the boundaries and the increase of the population of that country. They ordered first and most importantly, within the town of New Amsterdam, a municipal government. In the meantime, the States General should attract more people to move there and start a 15,000 guilder fund for people who couldn't pay their way. The States General then decided that Pieter Stuyvesant, the present director, shall be instructed to return home and report. Done and done. Van der Donck tasted total victory and pushed further. How about if the company wasn't in charge of the colony? After all, New Netherlanders had suffered at the hands of various company officials. Consider how much innocent blood, as well of heathens as of Christians, and even of sucklings, have been unnecessarily and barbarously shed. They should prosecute Cornelis van Tienhoven and others responsible for the Indian War, and Van der Donck had a handy-dandy list of questions to use in their interrogation. Well, that was a little premature. For now, the States General only let the American delegates go back to Manhattan to deliver the committee's suggestions to Stuyvesant. They'd also send along a shipment of guns for the defense of the colony and the people. Bout and van Couwenhoven sailed immediately, enthusiastically waved off by Van der Donck, who remained in the Republic to ensure nothing would stop the States General from adopting the committee's order. He might even get them to consider New Netherland an 8th state in the Dutch Republic. With the government tentatively being on the side of the colonists and Stuyvesant being recalled, Van der Donck started putting together a new administration. Hold your horses, son. You be fighting a mighty and powerful company and they weren't about to lie down and take it. And while Adriaan van der Donck was eager to get the show back on the road, the Prince of Orange was not done slowing him down. The committee's ruling displeased the West India Company. Okay, that's an understatement. The company was frothing at the mouth. Its delegates quickly prepared a rebuttal. Who did the States General think they were? They had no authority here, and they couldn't just infringe on their rights. Also, Director Stuyvesant followed the company's orders and the company didn't want colony reforms. Leave him out of this. The company privately informed the Director General that the States General request violated their charter and told him not to be in too much haste to commence his voyage, but to delay it until the receipt of further orders, and that he should do as he pleased. So, Stuyvesant, backed by the company, disregarded the authority of the States General and stayed put. Well, he moved. The Director General felt a military compound was no place for toddlers to toddle or a woman to woman. He took his family to the northern part of the island to land the West India Company reserved for its director. Stuyvesant bought the Bowery No. 1 farm from the company and land around it to create a 300-acre plantation. He built a manor and a chapel and commuted to Fort Amsterdam every day. The area became known as Noordwijk, the North District. Stuyvesant became ever more enraged with every new report that arrived from Old Netherland about the rebels' shameful claims to the States General. Cornelis Melijn, who'd assisted the delegates at The Hague, returned to New Amsterdam on the Nieuw Nederlandse Fortuin, bringing supplies and 70 colonists. In July, a storm swept the ship and the Nieuw Nederlandse Fortuin had to dock in Rhode Island to get fixed. The settlement at Rhode Island was founded in 1636 by Englishman Roger Williams, who'd been banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for his religious beliefs. Later, several colonies merged. It was named Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. The ocean state's name was officially shortened to Rhode Island in 2020. Technically, the docking violated the West India Company's laws regarding trade without a license, but since no one did any trading, Stuyvesant, nothing if not vindictive, confiscated the ship anyway the moment it sailed into New Amsterdam harbor and put Melijn as the de facto owner of the vessel on trial. But the director couldn't provide evidence of trade and he had to release him, but he confiscated both ship and cargo. This dictatorial move ended up costing the company a ton of money. They got slammed with huge claims of Mr. van der Capelle, the actual owner of the Nieuw Nederlandse Fortuin. But Melijn never got his supplies back. Instead, Stuyvesant drummed up a few fresh charges and seized his property in New Amsterdam. Cornelis Melijn, seeing the writing on the wall, moved to Staten Island, where he built a fort to defend against any attacks from tyrant Stuyvesant. The late King of England's son and heir, Charles, Prince of Wales, followed his brother James, Duke of York, to the Republic to seek refuge with their brother-in-law, the Stadtholder Prince Willem of Orange, who welcomed them with open arms and supported them financially. The States General were like, the English are gonna hate us for this. Charles asked the States General for troops and money to reclaim the throne. While Willem and some states were willing, Holland killed the plan. No more foreign shenanigans! In April 1650, Vice Admiral Witte Corneliszoon de Witt in Brazil on behalf of the West India Company and the States General had not received his requested supplies. Enraged, the admiral headed home, where he and his men were promptly arrested for disobeying orders. Prince Willem of Orange locked up de Witt in The Hague, but the city of Amsterdam broke those arrested by the Amsterdam Admiralty out of jail. They said the States General can't arrest anyone without the city's permission. Yes, this was common practice in wartime, but the war is over. Prince Willem fumed he'd bring arrogant Amsterdam down to its bony knees and was convinced the other states would gladly help him tune all of Holland up a little. The prince offered France a deal. In exchange for their troops and money, he and the 6 other states would fight Holland and then renew the war against Spain. Huzzah! On June 4th, 1650, the states of Holland dismissed the captains of 12 cavalry squadrons and 31 infantry companies. The following day, stadholders Willem and Willem Frederik crashed the Holland Assembly with the entire Council of State. Troops, who'd sworn an oath of loyalty to the States General, couldn't be dismissed without their say-so. The prince would go on tour to talk to each of the 18 voting cities of the state of Holland in person. The States General told him, sure, go ahead, but the Holland delegation dissented because, of course. On June 8th, the prince, his commissioners and 400 high and low-ranking officers embarked on a yacht and headed for Dordrecht, the city with first voting rights in the Holland Assembly. They swung by IJsselmonde first, where His Highness had to say toodaloo to his brother-in-law, heir to the throne of England, Charles Stuart, who was leaving for Scotland hoping to get his crowns back. Willem's tour had mixed results. Some cities were pro-prince and received him with open arms. Some were ambivalent but let him speak. Some wouldn't even let him in. While Amsterdam was downright rude and vowed to strip the prince of his stadtholderate. Whenever a town's regents refused to hear the prince, he went out in the streets to meet and greet the locals and got them all riled up against their city's government. Once home, the prince addressed the states of Holland, and vowed to make Amsterdam kneel before him. The States of Holland quickly arranged a meeting with the prince, hoping to calm him down, but then they told him he served at the pleasure of the state. Well, that wasn't exactly true. Still, the two parties made considerable concessions and got very close to making a deal. However, the prince only played along to lull Holland into a false sense of security. The man was plotting a surprise attack on Amsterdam. Time to find out who was the real master of the country, His Highness or Holland. The surprise attack on Old Amsterdam was such a large operation involving so many people that it was hardly a secret. France wasn't informed of the plan, but must have heard rumors. Diplomat Gerrit Pieter's Schaap, all the way in London, spoke of a siege of Amsterdam. Captain Frans Banning-Kok, yes, the main man in Rembrandt's Night Watch, and a representative of Amsterdam in the States General, left The Hague for Amsterdam to warn them of a dark cloud. And yet, Amsterdam's 4 mayors ignored all the red flags and didn't bother to prepare for a possible attack. The Prince of Orange's assault on Amsterdam was extremely well prepped, with route inspections, a thorough reconnaissance of the city, and well-timed schedules. Willem would go to Utrecht under the guise of needing to inspect the troops. While he was there, he'd send a letter to the 2 available Amsterdam mayors, Cornelis Bicker and Anthony Oetgens van Waveren, to lure them over. Then he'd imprison them, seize Amsterdam, and replace the city's government. After that, Willem would change the regimes of other uncooperative Holland towns. But the plans changed. In the end, it was Stadholder Willem Frederik in Utrecht with the assembled states' armies, and the mayors weren't lured. The prince was at the stadholder's quarters at the Binnenhof in The Hague to arrest wayward government officials. He had a long list, but ended up arresting 6. The pensionary of Hoorn, Nanning Keizer, the pensionary of Medemblik, Nicolaas Stellingwerf, the pensionary of Haarlem, Albert Janszoon de Ruyl, the former mayor of Dordrecht, Jacob de Wit, the mayor of Delft, Jan Duis van Voorhout, and the mayor of Haarlem, Jan Janszoon de Waal. Well, this was a step-by-step replay of 1618 when, at the exact same location, the captain of the Prince's Guard, on orders of Prince Maurits of Orange and by the authority of the States General, arrested Johan van Oldenbarneveld, Hugo de Groot, Gilles van Ledenberg and Rombout Hogebeets. Willem also copied his late uncle when he locked them up at Loevestein Castle. Why these men? Who knows? They weren't all members of the Bicker League, a mafia-like group of Republicans who wanted to destroy the House of Orange, or at the very least limit its powers. It could have been that they'd all been influencers who had convinced Holland to conclude a separate peace in the 80 Years' War in defiance of the Prince and France. Willem probably just wanted to put the fear of him in other dissidents. He announced he'd bring the 6 before a special court, mirroring the events of 1618, where they'd be found guilty of something and then executed. This move worked. The States of Holland were paralyzed and didn't dare make a move. The assault on Old Amsterdam was a go. On Friday evening, July 29, 1650, Sergeant Major Élie de Gentilhot and his men took up a position in a boat in Ouwerkerk. Once Willem Frederik arrived with the troops, they'd seize the Reguliers Poort, which was only guarded by 1 sentry and a handful of musketeers and pikemen. But he didn't arrive. Willem Frederik waiting for Captain Bernhard Mumm zu Schwarzenstein, who led the main cavalry force. Because of bad weather, Mumm couldn't find the road market to Apkoude and got lost. When the captain ran into the mailman from Hamburg to Amsterdam, he asked him for directions. However, Captain Dumbutt let the man go after he pointed the way. The postman raced to Amsterdam's only mayor in town, Cornelis Bicker, that he had seen an army headed this way. You're kidding, right? Pulling my leg? Haha, funny. Bicker's smile faded when farmers raced into town, ducking for cover from an approaching army. He had no idea which army was coming. He thought they were roving remnant troops of the 30 Years' War. The mayor and the city council quickly ordered the gates and water barriers closed, the drawbridges raised, some 90 cannons dragged to the ramparts, the land around the town flooded, and told the citizen militia to join the city's garrison. The following day, Mumm joined the prince's army, as did the Gentilhot boat troops. They'd snuck out the night before, worried that otherwise they might be seen. The entire army now moved on Amsterdam. Well, the surprise was gone. Willem Frederik then blundered by sending a trumpeter to the city gates carrying the letter of submission from Prince Willem. This was the wrong letter, the one to be delivered only after the town was occupied. Oops. City representatives realized at once what was happening and told Willem Frederik to stop right there, son. They were prepared to defend the town. That evening, while at dinner, the prince received the news that the surprise of Amsterdam had failed. He ran into his room, where the dinner guests heard him stamping his feet. What now? Willem asked Ban and Kok to go to Amsterdam and tell them if they fired Oetgens van Waveren and Bicker, the prince would withdraw his troops. Ban and Kok was like, no. Fine, I'll go myself. On July 31st, 1650, Prince Willem set out for Amsterdam, but secretly he hoped the States General would recall him, so he could walk away from the failed venture, honor intact. Meanwhile, Willem Frederik set up the troops into 4 quarters and Amsterdam was blocked in on the land side. However, to properly besiege the town, they needed a blockade from the water. Zeeland and Friesland and Holland cities Rotterdam and Enkhuizen were persuaded to help. It would have worked, but it was moot. Willem, the Prince of Orange, arrived at his headquarters in Amstelveen and wrote the Amsterdam government, "Why so hostile? Why so unfriendly? Come on, we should talk. Let me in." Fine, he could come in, without troops and only his usual entourage. No, he'd bring his troops to replace the garrison. "Remove your army, Highness. Make concessions in troops dismissal and ditch some of your regents, Mr. Mayor, sir." Fine, we'll discuss the dismissal of soldiers, but the regents stayed. Also, release the 6 Holland Assembly members from Loevestein. No. This arguing back and forth went on for a while, until the prince got one of his demands met. The Bicker brothers, Andries and Cornelis Bicker, would be removed from office. Well, they volunteered to retire to save the city. The prince released the prisoners at Loevestein, but all were fired from their government positions. Amsterdam flinched. Perhaps because they read the room, since no other towns in the area came to their rescue. Perhaps because they feared the economic disaster if they were properly besieged. Either way, on August 3rd, 1650, Amsterdam signed the treaty. If they'd only waited a few more hours, they could have spared themselves the humiliation. The ink was not yet dry when delegations from the States General and the States of Holland arrived with an order for the prince to stand down. Willem was relieved. He'd avoided a siege and most Holland towns backed the prince's actions. However, nothing really changed. Meanwhile, this whole old Amsterdam coup attempt kept the new Amsterdam situation up in the air. And who knows, another coup might be around the corner. Well, it never got that far. In October 1650, Prince Willem took a break from all the hoopla and went on a hunting trip with his cousin on the Veluwe. The prince caught a fever. It was smallpox. And on November 6, 1650, the Prince of Orange died, aged 24. 8 days later, on November 14th, his English wife, Mary Henrietta Stuart, gave birth to his heir, Willem III, Prince of Orange, Count of Nassau, etc., etc., etc. That evening, the States General convened an emergency meeting. What do we do with a baby stadholder? Holland, Zeeland and Utrecht figured they could do without. A few months later, for the first time since 1579, the leaders of all the Republican states met in The Hague for the Grote Vergadering, the Great Assembly. After months of talk, the Assembly decided that no new stadholders would be appointed. What history dubbed het eerste stadhouderloze tijdperk, the first stadholderless period, began. Meanwhile, Pieter Stuyvesant was busy saving the New Netherland colony from the hungry hippo New Englanders. When the only New England friend of New Netherland, the governor of Massachusetts, John Winthrop, died, aged 61 in 1649, the governors kept stalling the meeting to finalize the New Netherland-New England border issue. Stuyvesant kept hearing reports of English farmers entering New Netherland and picking fights with the Dutch farmers of the outlying boweries. The Director General couldn't afford to wait any longer or nothing would be left of New Netherland. The line any line had to be drawn, even if it meant ceding justly claimed Dutch territory to the English. Stuyvesant asked John Endicott, Winthrop's replacement as governor of Massachusetts Bay, "We are friends, right?" "Sure." The Massachusetts Bay government didn't want any trouble, but Governors Theophilus Eaton of New Haven and Edward Hopkins of Connecticut were like, "What do you mean, friends? We ain't friends." Stuyvesant pulled out the big boogeyman. "Hey, so, do you want a visit from the Dutch Navy? 'Cause that can easily be arranged." Listeners, it could not. But the English didn't know that, and Endicott and his buddies pressured the other New Englanders into agreeing to a meeting to determine boundaries. The governors told Stuyvesant to come to Boston. Stuyvesant told them to come to Manhattan. They compromised and met in Hartford, some miles up what the Dutch called the Fresh River, now the Connecticut River. Technically Dutch territory, but occupied by the English. On September 17, 1650, Governor Stuyvesant left Manhattan with an imposing entourage. He also brought 2 Englishmen, his English secretary George Baxter and Thomas Willett of Plymouth. The colonists protested, "Why bring the English to convince the English to let go of English territory? Any of you Dutchmen fluent enough in English to do the negotiating?" Yeah, didn't think so. Besides, Stuyvesant was the big boss man, so everyone else, shut up. The Director General made a few landfalls along the way, and everywhere he was treated with great respect by the residents. All Englishmen. Stuyvesant was shook. The Dutch claimed Connecticut, but there were so many English. All the Dutch had was that teeny-tiny Fort de Goede Hoop manned by a handful of Dutch soldiers and their commander, Gijsbert Opdijk. The eastern end of Long Island didn't look any better. Stuyvesant realized what the Dutch had discovered, what the Dutch had charted, what the Dutch had claimed, the Dutch didn't occupy. On September 23rd, the Director General arrived at Hartford and greeted his fellow statesmen. The New Englanders pulled out their best wines and treated Stuyvesant like a visiting head of state. The director ruffled some feathers by making his first communication from Hartford in New Netherland, but the feathers were smoothed out. The ensuing talks were intense, but civil. To streamline the talks, the colony rulers appointed 4 delegates, 2 from each side, to finalize the details. Eaton and Hopkins wanted to give nothing, but Stuyvesant and Endicott stacked the deck in their favor by ensuring that the New England negotiators were from the less anti-Dutch colonies of Massachusetts Bay and New Plymouth. In the final agreement, Stuyvesant gave up only what was already lost, the territory now occupied by New Haven and Connecticut. In exchange, the English acknowledged a permanent boundary between them and the Dutch colony. They established a north-south line that ran through Long Island and the mainland. The eastern 2/3 of the island and territory on the mainland east of present-day Greenwich, Connecticut, went to New England. Everything to the west went to the Dutch. For the time being, the inhabitants of Greenwich, Connecticut remained under Dutch government. Around Hartford, the Dutch kept the lands they actually held and cultivated. The Dutch were not to build any houses within 6 miles of the line. The treaty didn't mention the Dutch territories on the South or Delaware River where New Sweden had set up shop. Eaton and Hopkins weren't pleased with the Hartford Treaty, because of course they weren't. But those in New Amsterdam were none too pleased either. How could Stuyvesant abandon such a large chunk of New Netherland? How come they never had a say in these matters? See? Company tyrant. The Director General shrugged. My command, my rules, my treaty. Stuyvesant told the company about the agreement, but for some reason he never sent them a copy. The West India Company didn't approve of any of it. And the States General were like, "So, Van der Donk, this is what you were talking about, huh? The Connecticut River should have been the eastern boundary of New Netherland, and all of Long Island are belong to us." Well, Monday morning quarterbackers back home, if that's what you wanted, you should have sent over more colonists to occupy the land, and more soldiers to defend it, and more ships, and more supplies, guns, ammo, cannons, gunpowder. We're stretched to the limit here. And let's make one thing clear. You got more than what you paid for. In hindsight, Stuyvesant's negotiations had been brilliant. He'd used diplomacy and bluff to get New England to keep their paws off New Netherland. He'd only given up what was already lost, and at last got English recognition of his colony's sovereignty. But the treaty still had to be ratified in the home countries to become official. Well, good luck with that. The English governors may have concluded a treaty that set a border in the north, but the English colonists were like, no one said anything about the southern border. In Manhattan Harbor, Pieter Stuyvesant caught 50 New Haven folk on their way to settle in the Dutch territory near the Delaware on land they claimed they'd bought from the Native Americans. Despite the southern border never being mentioned in the Hartford Treaty, Stuyvesant considered this a breach of said treaty. He arrested the leaders and kept them locked up until they put in writing they weren't going to Delaware. The immigrants returned to New Haven. The ever more paranoid Stuyvesant thought this was all part of an English plot to wipe the Dutch from America, and warned Governor Eaton of New Haven, "I shall employ force of arms and martial opposition, even to bloodshed, against all English intruders within southern New Netherland." Them's fighting words. Stuyvesant was sure war was imminent, but wars cost money he didn't have. So he demanded that the authorities of Rensselaerswijk pay into New Netherland's defenses. Rensselaerswijk's agent Brand van Slichtenhorst sent over a commissioner to tell Stuyvesant no to his face. The patroon had funded the entire place without a dime from the company. Back off! The director arrested the commissioner and imprisoned him. Psst, you can probably escape. Go on, try it. While Stuyvesant was quite easygoing with the English New Netherlands settlers, he kept picking fights with the OG Dutch residents. The colonists wrote down every dispute and forwarded the list to Van der Donck in the Republic. He could use it as evidence of the company's arbitrary rule. But many English settlers supported Stuyvesant, so they sent the West India Company counter-remonstrances. They wrote, "We willingly acknowledge that the power to elect a governor from among ourselves, which is, we know, the design of some here, would be our ruin." When Stuyvesant discovered Vice Director Lubbert van Dinklage sent reports to the Republic confirming the residents' complaints, he expelled him from the council. The Vice Director protested. His commission was from the States General. So, Stuyvesant arrested him and locked him up in the guardroom of the fort. He also fired the notary who certified the Vice Director's protest and banned him from practicing law. 4 days later, Van Dinklage managed to escape. Is anybody ever standing guard in New Netherland? He sought asylum with Cornelis Melijn in his fort on Staten Island. Director General Stuyvesant replaced Van Dinklage with Johannes Dijkman, a more obedient subordinate. When Schout-Fiscaal Hendrik Thomas van Dijk complained about Van Dinklage's fate, Stuyvesant had the man demoted to clerk. When Van Dijk objected, the Director General got as angry as if he could swallow him up. And when Van Dijk continued to disobey, he'd put him in confinement or bastonadoed him with his rattan. Van Dinklage wrote to Van der Donck, "Our great Moscovy Duke keeps on as of old, something like the wolf. The longer he lives, the worse he bites. And he proceeds no longer by words or writings, but by arrests and stripes." The paranoid director placed spies among the Board of Nine and their associates. This voice of the people in their government crap, no more! From now on, he would make his own decisions. The 9 men wrote Van der Donck, "See, this is what we're talking about. This grievous and unsuitable government ought at once to be reformed. The measures ordered by the home government should be enforced so that we may live as happily as our neighbors. Our term of office is about to expire. The Director General has declared that he will not appoint any other selectmen. We shall not dare again to assemble in a body, for we dread unjustifiable prosecutions, and we can already discern the smart thereof from afar." The escalating conflict forced Stuyvesant to increase his security detail to 4 soldiers whenever he went about town. Oliver Cromwell, whose family of landowners had gained great wealth during the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, had joined Parliament just as King Charles I dissolved it for the umpteenth time. Cromwell became Charles's most outspoken critic, and during the Civil War, he'd been a devoted general in the parliamentary forces. He'd been the leading advocate of Charles's execution, and when the military junta took over the government, there was a power vacuum, which Cromwell quickly filled. He was in charge now. Right after Prince Willem of Orange's attack on Amsterdam, Holland had approached Cromwell with a suggestion. Weren't they the same now? Politically, religiously, commercially? How about the Republic and the Commonwealth merge? They'd made the offer to scare Willem into submission, but Cromwell thought Holland was serious, thinking the merger could fix all trade troubles in one fell swoop. The English would grant the Dutch Asia and Africa, and they would help him fight the Spanish to get all of the Americas. In 1651, Cromwell sent a large delegation to the Republic to discuss plans. But with Willem dead and buried, Holland was like, "Oh, you thought we were serious? Nah, mate, we're not restarting a war with Spain. Go away." Cromwell was mad to have been led on like that. The nasty, dickish Dutch. In the meantime, the late King of England's son and heir Charles Prince of Wales had pretty much failed all his attempts to gain the crown and returned to the Republic. Now the Dutch wanted to negotiate a new trade agreement with the Commonwealth. On June 24, 1651, the Dutch handed the English 36 fair play rules. For instance, the seas should be open to all ships and their cargo must be safe from capture. No letters of marque during peacetime, and Dutch traders should be treated equally to English traders in English territories across Europe and the Americas. These rules benefited the Dutch more than the English, and, as expected, the English didn't appreciate the Dutch demands for fair trade. The Dutch had done awful things to the English with, everyone say it with me now, the Amboina Massacre. But had they improved their ways? No. The Republic had offered the royalist refugees a safe haven, not the least of which was the pretender to the throne, Charles Stuart. And did they play nice when the English asked to expel them? No. They flat out refused. Worse, some English nobles in exile rallied around Willem's widow Mary Henrietta Stuart and paid Orange fans to besiege the English embassy in The Hague. In the end, English diplomats could only safely leave the building under military escort. Maybe the king once put up with that behavior. No more. England was under new management, the management being Oliver Cromwell, and the champion of Puritans was done playing around. While the Stuart monarchs had considered the colonies as a source of income, Cromwell, a nonconformist Puritan, considered the colonies a promised land in the making. Once upon a time, he'd even considered emigrating himself. While in office, he developed big plans for America, but those dickish Dutch kept getting in the way. The English Civil War had made New Amsterdam's port vital for all New World trade, and Cromwell didn't like that one bit. While he couldn't stop English trade flowing through the port without harming the Virginia tobacco farmers, he vowed to back New England in seizing Manhattan from the Dutch so that the English could take over the world. Mwahaha! But if one wanted to take on the Dutch, one had to take on a mighty fleet. The English didn't have a big enough fleet to take them on. Yet. Therefore, Cromwell increased taxes to build himself a proper English navy. While the building went underway, he tried to legislate the Dutch monopoly in Europe, Asia, and North America to death first. However, the Dutch grinned. Which of another country's laws should we obey? That's right, none. You king killers can suck it. Oh, snap. In October 1651, trumpets and drums sounded in the Old Exchange in London, and the Commonwealth Parliament publicly proclaimed the Act of Navigation. Under this act, only English vessels with English crews were allowed to import goods from Asia, Africa, and America to England. Also, European goods could only come in on English ships or vessels from the product's country of origin, aka not the Dutch ever, under any circumstance. We had a meeting, it's not gonna happen. The Dutch can suck it. War was coming. The official reason given for the Navigation Act was to organize trade in the North American colonies. But everyone the world over knew what it was really about. The hardcore protectionist policy was aimed specifically at the Republic, and everyone the world over was fuming. The Dutch government quickly sent a 3-man delegation to renegotiate the 36 articles. In the meantime, could they suspend the Navigation Act? Please. The English Council of State was like, no. In fact, they piled on a few extra demands. They wanted the Dutch to pay for the damage they'd allegedly done to English trade in Greenland, Brazil, and the East Indies. And they demanded an end to the Dutch United East India Company's blockade of the English East India Company. The Dutch were like, no. War was coming. In a last-ditch effort, the States General brought back their highest-ranking official, Raadspensionaris Adriaan Pauw, from retirement and sent him to London for emergency talks with Cromwell's Council of State. Cut out these hostile actions! The council was like, no. With the English already banned from Dutch colonies, the Navigation Act shouldn't bother the Dutch. War was coming. The States General quickly ordered to ready 150 warships and told outposts across the globe to strengthen their defenses. Because Stuyvesant's Hartford Treaty had not yet been ratified, the ambassadors in England pushed for a permanent border between the Dutch and English colonies in the Americas. No. The English were the first settlers in North America, from Virginia to Newfoundland. We know nothing of any Dutch plantations there, excepting a few settlers up on the Hudson. We do not think it necessary at present to settle the boundaries. It can be done hereafter, at any convenient time. The good vibes in The Hague after the Peace of 48? Gone. War was coming. In New Netherland, Pieter Stuyvesant had a detailed report drawn up about the mess going on in the region the Dutch called the South, now Delaware River, which ex-director Pieter had claimed on behalf of the Swedes 10 years earlier. Stuyvesant wasn't worried about the Swedes going rogue. No, he worried that once the English realized they could take control of that South River, the resulting New England sandwich would squeeze New Netherland out of existence. Therefore, the Dutch needed to reclaim New Sweden. But how? New Sweden's governor, Johan Björnsson Prins, a large man the Indians called Big Belly, was a 30 years war veteran. He'd been discharged for surrendering Chemnitz to the Saxon army and hoped to find redemption by turning the North American wilderness into a profit-making colony for his queen Christina. Prins, worried about the New Netherland then-director Willem Kief's possible moves, launched a fake news campaign. See that war being waged against the Indians north? They're coming for you too, and will slaughter every single one of you. Then he made better trade deals with them. Meanwhile, Prince built another fort on a swamp farther downriver, closer to the bay, thinking it would give the Swedes greater control of the South River. Kieft had done nothing about it, but the Swedes were forced to abandon Fort Mugenborg, Fort Mosquito. Not because of Dutch soldiers, but because of the many mosquitoes. In June 1651, Director General Stuyvesant marched overland with 120 soldiers to Fort Nassau. At the same time, several armed ships sailed from New Amsterdam up the Delaware River. Stuyvesant then bought all the land south of Fort Christina, all the way to Bombay Hook from the Native Americans. With a proper display of military force to mess with the Swedes, the Director General dismantled Fort Nassau, and then at Zandhoek, a reasonably suitable place about a mile from the Swedish Fort Christina, he built a fort named Casimir, which was supplied with people and ammunitions of war according to circumstances. Both Fort Nassau and Fort Beversrede on the Schuylkill were abandoned in favor of Fort Casimir, and the West India Company Sergeant Gerrit Bicker was left in command with a garrison of 12 men. While the new fort was under construction, Governor Prins built a Swedish fort right next to it, just to mess with the Dutch. One officer whined to Stuyvesant that the fort is the greatest insult in the world, for they have located the house about 12 or 13 feet from our palisades, depriving us thereby of our view of the stream. Another official wrote, "My lord, I firmly believe that Prince had built it there more to mock our lords than to expect that it could realize any profit from it, since there's room enough beside our fort to build 20 such houses." Stuyvesant was like, "To the warships!" Okay, not yet. He sent a stack of instructions to the Dutchmen in the area. Buy up more land from the Delaware and the Minquas, repair the Dutch forts, and stock them with goods. The Swedes had been cut off from supplies from their homeland, and the Minquas were upset that when they traveled from far away Aville with their furs, the traders were always out of supplies. The Dutch should step up and make bank. Keeping the peace and re-establishing relations with the Indians was part of Stuyvesant's prime directive. So, when the Minquas complained to him that New Amsterdam trader Govert Lokermans, while on a South River expedition, had killed their chief, Stuyvesant was like, great, just great. Lokermans denied it, claiming he had only roughed up the chief a bit. Off with Lokermans' head! Or, Stuyvesant instructed his official to inquire diligently into the circumstances and truth of the matter, and should you find Govert Lokomans to be at fault, conceal it, so that on our part the Indians are given no occasion for new discontent. When the company directors in Old Amsterdam found out about the directors' enthusiastic actions on the South River, they were stunned. Stuyvesant had never said a word about going down south to scare the Swedes, and worried about what the Swedish government would do. Hopefully, they'd acknowledge the Dutch claim. But that new fort? What was that about? Time will instruct us of the design of the new-built Fort Casimir. We're at a loss to conjecture for what reason it has received this name. You ought to be on your guard that it be well secured, so that it cannot be surprised. Stuyvesant turned his gaze north to that pesky, semi-independent state of Rensselaerswijk. In 1652, Pieter Stuyvesant secured the future of New Netherland by declaring that from now on, no one could buy land from Native Americans without his approval. Any and all large sales of the past were declared null and void. He ordered the pretended proprietors to return the purchase money. If they wanted to keep the tracts they bought, they had to petition to the director and get permission from the council. The patroons feared the Director General would carry out his threat and take the land granted them under the Charter of Privileges. The Rensselaerswijk government called together all its residents and made them swear an oath to maintain and support offensively and defensively the right and jurisdiction of the colony against everyone. The patroon's younger half-brother, Jan Baptista van Rensselaer, the first Rensselaer to set foot in New Netherland, also took the oath. Meanwhile, the Rensselaerswijk commissioner escaped his Manhattan prison. Really? Someone? Anyone? Improve security? Sheesh. He boarded a sloop at Staten Island and fled upriver to a settlement Brand van Slichtenhorst had founded in Rensselaerswijk, the place close to Fort Orange's defenses that the Director General had partially pulled down. When the captain, who had given the man a lift, returned to New Amsterdam, Stuyvesant arrested the skipper and slapped him with a heavy fine. The Director General just sorta casually swung by the Rensselaerswijk adjacent Fort Orange. He was in the neighborhood, you know. Rumors quickly spread that he'd come to build gallows for those who dared defy him. The director bluntly told the authorities that the boundaries of their exempted territory would be determined according to his rules. Once determined, he'd only recognize the patroon's jurisdiction within those limits. Naturally, the area couldn't include any purchases from the Indians after the land grant. Well, Agent van Slichtenhorst argued, we're gonna need to take this up with the States General. No delays. The director sent 14 soldiers armed with muskets to van Slichtenhorst's house. They fired a volley and pulled down the patroon's flag. Stuyvesant declared the town would be independent of the patroon's rule from now on. He incorporated the place in the New Netherland colony and named it Beverwyck, today's Albany. Though some say van Slichtenhorst already named it Beverwyck. Van Slichtenhorst immediately ordered the director's placards announcing this change to be torn down and posted a counter-proclamation. Beverwyck belonged to the patroon of Rensselaerswijk. Dude, you know what's gonna happen. Yep. Stuyvesant arrested van Slichtenhorst, held him in Fort Orange, and then imprisoned him in New Amsterdam, where they'd finally learned the lesson. Brand was held under close guard, at least until Jan Baptista van Rensselaer was formally appointed in his place. Van Slichtenhorst returned to the Netherlands 3 years later, where he sued the Rensselaers patroon over back pay. Stuyvesant had won. From now on, Rensselaerswijk obeyed his every command. While the whole Prince of Orange drama unfolded, Adriaan van der Donck and Cornelis van Tienhoven had several meetings with members of the States General to plead their cases. The States General asked van Tienhoven to answer some questions from van der Donck's list concerning the Indian War, but the man cleverly dodged the issue and then, poof, he was gone. When the States General heard van Tienhoven might flee the country, they issued a decree forbidding him to leave. But he slipped away to New Amsterdam with his girlfriend Lisbeth Kroon, the daughter of an Amsterdam basket maker. She thought he wanted to marry her on Manhattan Island. She didn't realize the man was already married. When the secretary returned, Stuyvesant appointed van Tienhoven as Hendrik van Dijk's replacement. Ooh, that's not a good look. Not for Stuyvesant, and not for the company fighting to survive in the Republic. Van Dyck fumed. The perjured secretary returned here contrary to their high mightinesses' prohibition, a public, notorious, and convicted whoremonger and oathbreaker, a reproach to this country and the main scourge of both Christians and heathens. The fault of drunkenness could easily be noticed in me, but not in Van Tienhoven, who has frequently come out of the tavern so full that he could get no further and was forced to lie down in the gutter. Stuyvesant's bold move gave Van der Donck all he needed to deal a death blow to the West India Company, which was already on life support. On February 10, 1652, Adriaan van der Donck appeared before the entire States General, filled with distinguished gentlemen. Among them was Grand Pensionary Adriaan Pauw, whose brother Michiel was a company director and patroon of Pavonia, but also the up-and-comer Johan de Witt, son of Loevestein prisoner Jacob de Witt. More about Johan and his brother Cornelis in the next episode. With Van Tienhoven gone, Van der Donck's case was easy to make. Manhattan and the surrounding land was an important base. From there, they could explore the uncharted territories of North America and claim it all. Yes, the West India Company had blown it, but it wasn't too late to turn things around. The States General should put an end to the company's bureaucracy, introduce Dutch law in New Netherland, grant its people the rights of Dutch citizens, and give its capital New Amsterdam all the rights and protections of a Dutch city. Then New Netherland would flourish, and the Dutch Republic could reap the rewards. He brought receipts of the company's and its directors' unacceptable behavior. The colony's current boss, Pieter Stuyvesant, cracked down hard, targeting mainly the elected 9-men members. He took their property and threatened to lock them up or banish them, unless they swore they knew nothing of the director and his government but what is honest and honorable. He'd already banned the States General appointed vice director and the notary, forbidding them from doing their job. And let's not even speak of the dreadful Hartford Treaty, in which the New England governors had pulled the wool over the director's eyes. Stuyvesant's surrender cost them land and future profits. It was a convincing closing argument, and with Van Tienhoven gone, the director had no one to defend him. However, the clincher for the States General was the latest slew of updates of Stuyvesant's arbitrary and dictatorial rule. The colony was no longer filled with soldiers and company employees. There were many prominent and wealthy residents who'd risked it all to move there. The government had a responsibility to protect them from Darth Stuyvesant. The States General turned to the different chambers of the West India Company. What say you? The Zeeland Chamber put all the blame squarely at the Amsterdam Chamber. Others concurred, reorganized the lot. The States General was like, that settles it. Time for a massive colony overhaul. The Amsterdam's chamber's top brass were miffed, but in order to silence everyone, they quickly ordered Stuyvesant to establish a municipal government in New Amsterdam with a bench of justice formed as much as possible on the laws of this city. Too little, too late. On April 27, 1652, the States General wrote the letter that Van der Donck had been eager to get his grubby little hands on from the moment he stepped off the ship in Amsterdam 2.5 years ago. No flowery salutations this time, just a short and sweet message. To Pieter Stuyvesant, Director General in New Netherland, Honorable, etc. We have, in view of the public service, considered it necessary to require you, on sight hereof, to repair hither, in order to furnish us circumstantial and pertinent information as to the true and actual condition of the country and affairs, also of the boundary line between the English and Dutch there. Done 27th of April 1652. The States General handed Van der Donck Stuyvesant's recall letter and told him to deliver it to the Director General in person. After doing a little victory dance, probably, you don't know, the lawyer quickly prepared his departure. In May, Van der Donck formally asked the government permission to return to Manhattan and resume his previous political role, to hold peaceably the office of President of the Commonalty in New Amsterdam. Then, on May 29, 1652, mere weeks after Van der Donck's request, a shot rang out in the English Channel. All the lawyer's best laid plans fell in the water, because the West India Company was about to roar back to life. The war was here.